Seder. Oh. Good morning, everybody. 1 minute. נתן.
אני איתך.
הפכת אותי להוסט.
כן, כן, בטח.
בסדר, okay then. Right. Share screen. Good morning, everybody. Can everybody see me?
Yes.
Right, okay. Last shiur, 1 minute, let me just see myself. 1 minute, hold on 1 minute. Okay then, right. Okay, good morning, everybody. What we're going to do today is we're going to continue a very important subject which we started last week. Last week we spoke about the story of David HaMelech after Shaul, after he killed Goliath. And there's a short conversation between Shaul and Avner. Okay? The story is, let's just read it inside, the beginning of page number 5. And, sorry, 1 minute. Sorry, okay. And there it says the following, in line number 5. וכירות שאול את דוד יוצא לקראת הפלישתי, אמר אל אבנר, מי זה הנער? Avner, who is this young guy? And Avner says, I don't know. I'm not sure. ויאמר המלך שאל אתה. Go and find out who it is. And they found out it's David HaMelech. Last week when we spoke about it, we basically asked the question, what does it mean? Obviously, Shaul had been with David the whole time, and therefore he knew him. And then the question is, so therefore, what's going on here? And the Gemara in Masechet Yevamot tells us there's sort of a discussion which is taking place in the Beit HaMidrash, because Shaul now has promised the person who kills Goliath to give his daughter to him. And therefore now David will become the son-in-law of Shaul. Now, there's a very bad guy there. His name is Doeg HaEdomi, and he says, guys, Shaul, David HaMelech comes from Ruth. And Ruth is a Moabite. And how can David HaMelech marry into a Jewish family? A Moabite is never allowed to intermarry with the Jewish nation. And Doeg says, we've got a problem here. And the Gemara comes and tells us that no, that Avner answered him, what do you mean? Moavi velo Moavit. That a woman, a female, can intermarry, and that's how Boaz married her. And then the Gemara says that Doeg continued arguing with him until Amasa said, there is a halacha Moshe Sinai from which we've learned that a Moavi velo Moavit. And last week we gave a description, one explanation on this subject. And now we're going to learn the second explanation, which is perhaps the most important dimension of halakha. And the one who speaks about this is the Rav, the Brisker Rav, Rav Velvel, the uncle of Rav Soloveitchik, Rav Soloveitchik's father's brother, Rabbi Yitzchak Ze'ev, who was the Rav of Brisk, and eventually came to Eretz Yisrael in 1942. And he lived in Yerushalayim. There's a famous yeshiva Brisk now, a few yeshivot Brisk from his children and grandchildren, etc. And he gives the most important answer on this question, which perhaps allows us to delve into the development of Torah Sheba'al Peh. What are the parameters in arguments? When did the Tanaim argue and when did they not argue? What took place in the Beit HaMidrash? And now we're going to learn this very, very important section of the Brisker Rov. Now let's start. In front of you, on page, those who haven't got the pages, it's on page number 5, Daf Makorot 5. And now we're going to the bottom of it, and it starts off the following. Dushe agrees in line number 115. And then the introduction is the story of Ruth. And then the Brisker Rov carries on asking what happened in the Gemara. And he says the following. In line number 136, he says the following. Sorry, line number 130. V'od tzarich biyur. Ha'ita b'ktubot, we've learned in Masechet Ktubot, Demai dichtiv berut vayikach asara anashim miziknei ha'ir. He married Ruth in front of 10 people. Vayom eshvu pa vayeshvu. And the Gemara says, Delakach otam, Boaz, lemidrash amoni velo amonit. Boaz got all the important people of the city of Bethlehem, and he said, I'm allowed to marry them because I'm allowed to marry Ruth because of the special halacha, amoni velo amonit, moavit velo amonit. V'tzarich asara, and you needed 10 people to publicize it. Guys, there was no WhatsApp those days. There was no Facebook. There was no Twitter. The only way to publicize something was to get 10 people, and they would go around the whole of Eretz Israel telling this story that Boaz married Ruth because of the special halacha of Moavi v'lo Amonit. V'im kain, kvar bimei Boaz, in the days of Boaz, nidrasha v'nifseka kvar halacha. You already knew it. How, 50 years later, could Doeg come and ask about this subject? It was already decided. Boaz publicized it in front of everybody. Now, Vanir line number 137. Dine, Bet Din Gadol, the Bezdin, the Sanhedrin in Yerushalayim. Haya kovea uposek halacha. It could fix the halacha al pi shnei drachim, 2 ways. That means in the hands of the Sanhedrin, there were 2 ways of deciding what the halacha is. Number 1, mima shenimsa b'kabbalah me'halacha l'Moshe miSinai. One way is saying, this is a halacha l'Moshe miSinai. Finished. This is what's gone through the generations from Moshe Rabbeinu until now. Everybody knows it. For instance, let's give ourselves an example. Tefillin are halacha l'Moshe miSinai. When we is written in the Torah, Uchtavtam le'ot al yadecha v'ayu l'totafot beinenecha, how do we know it's tefillin? The Rambam says in Ilchot Tefillin, and it's a Gemara, there are 10 halacha l'Moshe miSinai in relation to tefillin. There was never ever an argument. What are tefillin? There was never ever an argument. What is an etrog? Even though it's written in the Torah, pre-etz hadar. There was never a machloket because that is halacha l'Moshe miSinai. That's the first way. K'mo shekatav Rambam b'Ilchot Mamrim, v'ala mishpat asher yomru lecha elu dvarim sheyilamdu otam min hadin be'achat min hamidot she'atorah nidreshet mehem mikol davar sheyagidu lecha. Another word, ze HaKabbalah. What is the difference between something which is learnt by halacha l'Moshe miSinai and something which is learnt of the midot she'atorah nidreshet every single day? Amar Rabbi Shmuel, the Chazan says, Amar Rabbi Shmuel, b'shloshes midot she'atorah nidreshet behem b'kal v'chomer b'gzera shove, etc., etc. Says the Rambam. What is the difference? The im halacha zu kavu midrash be'echad miyud gimel midot. If the halacha was learned through 13 ways of learning the Torah, b'shloshes midot, then what can happen? Yachol bet din echad lidrosh ba'ofen acher, v'lekvo halacha ba'ofen acher, k'mo shekatav Rambam. 13 midot, every generation could learn the Torah in a different way. Guys, when we learn Gemara, the Torah can be explained klal pratu klal, riboy miut riboy, etc., etc. Every generation, there was a new way of learning Torah. That's how there are machloket. And says the Rambam, Bet Din Gadol in line 145, שדרשו באחד מן המידות כפי מה שנראה ביניהם, ועמד אחריהם בית דין אחר ונראה לו טעם אחר לסתור, הרי זה סותר ודן כפי שנראה בעיניו. Every generation could learn Torah שבכתב in a different way completely. But, אבל כשההלכה קבועה על פי ההלכה למשה מסיני, when we say something is הלכה למשה מסיני, אם כן לבית דין אי אפשר לבית דין אחד לסתור ההלכה. You can't contradict it. ההלכה מקובלת מההלכה משה מסיני. Because that is הלכה משה מסיני, עיין שם פרק ג' דברי קבלה, אין בהם מחלוקת לעולם. There was never an argument. What do we learn from this, everybody? Two ways of learning Torah shebechtav. One way is through the midot, where the Torah nidreshet. One person has a gzera shova, another person doesn't have the gzera shova. One is doresh kal vachomer, another one isn't doresh kal vachomer. For 300 years, the Tanaim was speaking about this subject. How to learn Torah shebichtav. Then came the other one. 1 minute, Harold. Then comes the other way. The other way, which happened, was that it was a tradition from Moshe until that generation. Now, this is the dual way of explaining Torah shebichtav. Sometimes there were specific halachot l'Moshe miSinai, and in other subjects there weren't halachot l'Moshe miSinai. We will see when it comes to Moavi v'lo Moavit, this exactly was the problem. Harold, what do you want to ask?
Well, you're talking about Torah shebichtav.
Yes.
I would have thought this whole idea is Torah sheba'al peh. That
No,
this is
but
how we darshaned in order to arrive at Torah sheba'al peh.
Torah sheba'al peh is based on Torah shebichtav.
Yes.
Right. So how do we explain the Torah shebichtav?
Via Torah sheba'al peh, I guess. Okay.
Right. So Torah sheba'al peh is a medium of explaining the Torah shebichtav.
Okay.
What is the constant, the K? The K in mathematical terms is Torah shebichtav. What is something which is mobile and versatile is Torah sheba'al peh. But there's certain things which didn't have this versatility. It wasn't versatile. And what was that? Halacha l'Moshe miSinai. Halacha Moshe miSinai becomes a constant, a K. What do we mean by that? It means to tell us that tefillin, there was never a machloket. The only machloket which we have in tefillin took place later on. But everybody knew that tefillin were made of or beimat tahora. Everybody knew that you had to sew them up with gidin. Everybody knew that there were 4 parshiot. Everybody knew. There was never a machloket. The machloket which exists is which order you put them in, or how you put them in the tefillin. But what's inside the tefillin, we know, etc. Etrog, we know what it is. That's halacha l'Moshe miSinai. Anybody who learned Masechet Tanit will remember Nisuch HaMayim is halacha l'Moshe miSinai, etc., etc. So therefore, they're those things which were the kvuim, the halachot kvuot. Now, okay, Harold, it's clear.
Okay.
Okay, this is the explanation, and this is exactly what took place in the time of Boaz. Says the Briskerov, the following: Lefize, line 150. Mitba'er eikev parsha zu shel David shedanu alav. This was the argument. Sorry, 1 minute. Sorry. Right. לפי זה מתבהר היטב פרשה זו של דוד, שדנו עליו עם כשר. אחרי מה שעידן מעידנים, years ago, פסק בועז כבר הלכה המוני ולא המונית, במדרש, he explained it as a מדרש, באחד מי"ג המידות היה. ולזה, because of that, יכול דואג לחלוק אתה, דבית דין אחר היה, ודרש הוא אחרת, שמצא טעם לסתור הלכה, הפסוקה, כפי כל סוגיית הגמרא. And he asked all these questions, until המסע, in line 157, אבל המסע שאמר, כך מקובלני, מבית דין של שמואל הרמתי, היינו הלכה למשה מסיני, וכך מפורש בסמ"ג, לאו מצווה קי"ג. ולזה אין יכולים לסתור ההלכה, גם ימצא טעם אחר לסותרה, כיוון שההלכה מקובלת מההלכה למשה מסיני. What happened here, guys? Boaz explained this halacha through the methods of Torah, of Yud Gimel Midot, of the way of explaining the Torah. Came along Amasa and he said, Ma pitom, Shmuel in his Bezdin, who was still alive at that time, said, Eli HaKohen told me this is halacha Moshe Sinai, Moavi v'lo Moavit. And Eli HaKohen received this from Pinchas, and Pinchas received it from Yoshua, and Yoshua received it from Moshe Rabbeinu. Oh, once this has taken place, no more arguments. Finished. The decision has been accepted, and nobody can argue with that. That is what Amasa did. He took a spear, so to speak, and he put it in the ground, and he said, this is the end of the argument. Halacha lo Moshe Sinai. You want to know where I know it from? Go to the Bezdin of Shmuel Hanovi. Oh, once he said, go to the Bezdin of Shmuel Hanovi, everybody said, okay, we accept your testimony, because since Shmuel is alive, and that was the whole point of it, since Shmuel was alive, then everybody knew how Shmuel Hanovi was a true prophet. Nobody was going to argue with that. That is the development of Torah Sheba'al Peh. Let me give you another example, which one of the great Meforshim, the Or Samech, the Meshech Chochmah, gives another example. There was a huge argument which takes place in the time of Hillel HaZaken, when Pesach, Erev Pesach, fell on Shabbat. And there was a huge argument, what do? Are you allowed to shecht the Korban Pesach on Shabbos? And Hillel came up and he said, this is what I've been accepted from my teachers, Shmaya v'Avtalyon. And Shmaya v'Avtalyon heard it from their teachers, and their teachers heard it from their teachers, that since it's written in the Torah, b'mo'ado, and we learn mo'ado that it's got a specific time, we know that Tritat Korban Pesach can be done on Shabbos. And that's what Hillel said. Again, it was a halacha l'Moshe Sinai. Let's give ourselves another example. Another halacha Moshe Sinai is doing bris milah on Shabbos. Where do we know that a brit milah we can do on Shabbos, even though it's considered one of the melachot? Because it's written, uvayom hashmini, even on Shabbos. So here we have different ways of learning the Torah. Some of them we are allowed to argue with in different periods of history. And then there are those which halacha Moshe Sinai, which we could never argue with. That was it. That is the way the Rav MiBrisk explains this amazing discussion which took place in the time of David HaMelech. Now, what's so interesting about this is that we have very, very few halachic decisions which took place, which we know of, took place during that period, and even until the destruction of the first temple. Tanakh does not speak about halachic arguments which took place then. We don't know of it. Only the development, and that's what Harold Batts was talking about, the development of Torah Shebaal Peh only takes place in the beginning of the Second Temple. When Am Yisrael come back to Eretz Yisrael, and that's why we say in the Mishnah, okay, Moshe kibel Torah miSinai u'Yisrael Yeshua Zkenim v'Neviim v'Neviim la'anshei Knesset Hagdola Em amu shlosha dvarim, and then all of a sudden, in the time of Shimon ben Shetach and all that period, then comes the arguments. We don't have anything before then, because often the arguments which took place were solved. The decision was taken also by Urim v'Tumim, Nevi'im, Sanhedrin, etc., etc., etc. But here we have one of the indications of an halachic argument which took place in the Beit HaMidrash of Shaul HaMelech. That is a very, very interesting subject, because it gives us an insight of the different ways of learning Torah in that period of history. Remember, no books. The only book which they had was Torah Shebichtav. As Harold quite rightly said, there was only oral law. So everybody had different opinions what the oral law was. And the only one who could really decide the true Kabbalah was Shmuel Hanovi, because Shmuel received his Torah directly from Moshe Rabbeinu, generation after generation. If there are any questions on that, please, because this is one of the most important ways of learning Tanakh. Yes, Phil.
It requires total trust, because logically speaking, the threat to the Jewish people were the women, not the men. Because the seduction of the Jews, the Jewish males in biblical times, was a terrible thing. And this is coming around and saying, no, women can come in, not the men. So it's very politically sounding, and of course it's a wonderful decision, and it came out the truth, but it sounds as type of thing that has an underlying to it, an underlying degree of modification that is not
true, but that seemed to be the halacha of Moshe Sinai at the time of Moshe Rabbeinu already.
If you call it, if the statement that this is halacha of Moshe Sinai, that's one thing. If you may say, oh, this halacha is Moshe Sinai, many years after Moshe at Sinai, it's a decision that could have been made as the best decision to be made, and therefore
it could have been correct. But on the other hand, without the final sealing of Shmuel Hanovi, that could have been an argument throughout history, and then David HaMelech wouldn't have existed at all.
Well, I agree with you. That's why I'm saying it was the right decision, and whether or not.
Do we know what's right or wrong?
Well, we know what works and what doesn't work after the years go by.
Sorry, what's that?
We know what the best decision is many years later.
Oh, true. Okay, true. But
in this case, in terms of a straight normal decision, it was more logical to cut out the women than to cut out the men.
True.
That's
true.
all I'm saying.
Yeah.
It's the right decision, obviously, but it may have been a very wise political decision taken by.
True.
That's
yes,
all.
Harold, what do you want to say?
Well, I mean, the presentation by the Brisker Rav is very interesting, although as an example, let's say, now I may be wrong, ayin tachat ayin, okay, and that's darshan is not as reflecting mamon. Now, I don't know, maybe they say that, how do we know that? Maybe that's halacha l'Moshe Sinai, but in other words, what he's saying is that the next generation could have come up with a different explanation, as to what ayin tachas ayin means.
Yeah,
Now,
okay.
I can't believe hard to believe that he would actually agree that they suddenly they could change such a.
Very good question. I'll read you out the Rambam on that. Okay? The Rambam on that subject says the following, just to give you an insight. Says the Rambam here. Here, the Rambam says, Perek Vav, Perek Rishon Vilchot Chovel Umazik. Af al pi shedvarim elu nir'im me'inyan Torah shebichtav, kulam mefurashim, hen mipi Moshe me'ar Sinai, v'kulam halacha lama'aseh biyadenu, v'kazeh ra'u avotenu danim. This is what our forefathers saw. Bebet dino shel Yoshua, ובבית דינו של שמואל הרמתי, ובכל בית דין ובית דין שעמדו ממות משה ועד עכשיו. עין תחס עין, according to the Rambam, is הלכה למשה מסיני. For the same reason. Okay? The same reason. Okay? That means that's what the Rambam says. Ayin tachas ayin is not an explanation of how we learn it from the Psukim, even though you can learn it from the Psukim. But he said, Halakha Moshe Sinai. The Rambam lists, okay, one of the great, and that's an example for you. Okay.
Yeah, I chose that example. I wasn't sure that.
I know you were, but it's a very good point.
Sure.
And I'll explain to you something. In the 1600s, there was a very great rabbi, Rabbi Bachrach, the famous Bachrach family. There was a famous, for instance, a big rov in Beit Vagan, Yoshua Bachrach. He wrote fascinating books, for instance, on what we're learning, on Esther. He was an expert in Tanakh. Okay, it's a very famous family, the Bachrach family, and he wrote Tshuvot called Chavot Yair. He lived in worms, and he was, at the beginning of his life, he was terribly affected by the Chmielnicki massacres. It was terrible, and he speaks about it a lot. And he writes, he's got a tshuva, a whole responsa going through every single halacha l'Moshe Sinai. And he questions a lot of the sources which we, so to speak, accept that they are halacha l'Moshe Sinai. And he says, where do you know it from? Now, in our generation, this would have been burnt. This tshuva would have been burnt. Okay? But he goes through the lists of the Gemaras and the sources which speak about the different halacha l'Moshe Sinai, and he says, how do you know it? Where do you know it from? Okay, a very, very interesting tshuva which breaks down a lot of what we call, what we nowadays believe is true. Those are all the truths which he questions. Okay, very, very interesting tshuva. Okay. Yes.
Question. Yeah. Well, since he mentioned ayin tachas ayin.
Who am I speaking to? Larry. Yes. Yeah.
Well, it is possible, and it may be possible in the near future to implant a new eye and restore a person's vision. In which case, if that would be possible, then you could do ayin tachas ayin literally by replacing the person's eye.
Could be, okay. True, okay. 100%.
Up until now, it's been impossible. So the best solution is compensation. But if you can do it literally, why not do it literally?
Yeah, but again, the person who would have to pay for the operation and all that wouldn't be done through Kupat Cholim, but it'd be done through the guy who damaged you.
Yeah, so he'd give him the money to.
So he gives the money for that. Yeah. Okay. Right. Okay.
Move on.
That's what we learned. Okay, which is very important. This Rabbi Brisk. And now I want to carry on to go now to page number 6. Okay. Now, what are we going to learn here? The next thing which we're going to learn now is the unfortunate incidents which take place between Shaul and David. We learned a few weeks ago how Shaul gets into terrible depressions. And he has this persecution complex. And he has a feeling that David is going to overtake him and going to become the new king, and he doesn't know where to put himself, etc., etc., etc. And we have about 3 chapters in the book of Shmuel telling us of how Shaul and his army run after David, and David has to hide. And what we're going to learn now, we're not going to learn all the incidents. They're too long. But what I want to learn now with you is one of the incidents which takes place. And now it's written the following. Page number 6. Anybody who's got the pages. David barach. David runs away. Vayimalet, and he escapes. Vayavo elo Shmuel aramata, and he goes to Shmuel. Vayaged lo, and he tells Shmuel et kol asher asa lo Shaul. And he goes and tells him all what Shaul is doing to him. Vayelech hu u'Shmuel, and he and Shmuel go. Vayeshvu benayot. Now we already spoke about this when we learned about Shmuel, but we're not going to learn about what they discuss, but we're going to learn the explanation of the Abrabanel. And the Abrabanel says the following. He says, David barach, vayimalet, vayavo el Shmuel, zachar hakatuv, sheDavid bא el Shmuel, והגיד לו את כל דרכי שאול ועסקיו, בכל 4 דרכים, all the 4 different ways, אשר כבר עשה להורגו, the different ways he was going to kill him. ועשה זה דוד, כפי ששאול היה נמשך על ידי שמואל. שמואל anointed שאול, ודוד גם כן נמשך על ידו. והיה שמואל נביא אלוקים, והלך דוד אליו, לזעוק. David went to cry in front of Shmuel, you appointed me as king, but look at my life now. ממה שהיה שאול עושה נגדו. ולבקש ממנו עצה ותנחומים. And David goes and expects Shmuel to give him advice and comfort him. ושיגיד לו ברוח נבואתו, and should tell him in his prophetical way, מה יעשה? ואיך ימלט את נפשו? How can he save himself? אחרי שהאמין, because David HaMelech believes, כי מהשם כל משפטו וכל מעשיו מושכחים. He believes everything is from Hashem. So David runs to Shmuel. Shmuel is a prophet. And David believes that Shmuel can give him some insights of what's going to be and how it's going to be and what's going to be with him. אחרי שהאמין כי מהשם כל משפטו וכל מעשיו מושכחים. ואמר שהלך דוד ושמואל וישבו בניות. זכר דוד ראשונה, and it says that David goes first. Why? ושמואל אחריו לכבוד המלכוס. וידמה שהיה ניות מקום סמוך לרמה. והיה שם מושב בני נביאים. The prophets used to be there. And they went to try to ask Hashem what to do. And what happens? Says the Chida in Chomat Tanakh, ושמואל הנביא עליו השלום לא השיבו. Shmuel Hanavi doesn't answer him, doesn't help him. וסתמו כפירושו. דוודאי לא יכול לו. ומה שמשך לו למלך ודאי יתקיים. So Shmuel is in a terrible predicament. He knows that David is the next king. And he's also anointed Shaul as a king. So how's Shmuel supposed to behave? He doesn't know what Hashem's going to do. And he doesn't give him any advice. All what they do is they go and learn Torah together. Because that is where, if you look in the page of Shmuel number 6, we will see that the Gemara tells us that there Shmuel hands over the plans of the Beis Hamikdash to David HaMelech. And that's what's written in the next source. But one of the things which is very interesting about this is the following. In the last section of page number 6, this page will go right down to the bottom and see the following. Written, Yamot Shmuel. Shmuel dies. Vayikavtzu kol Yisrael in line 160. Line 160. Vayikavtzu kol Yisrael veyaspidu lo. Shmuel dies. Siper mitat Shmuel. The Radak says, he tells us the death of Shmuel. Ki efshar shemet Shmuel b'zeh ha'perek shenifrad Shaul miDavid. And what does the Malbem say? Kol chayei Shmuel. Lo nigla hadavar sheshmuel mashach et David. Shmuel never ever reveals the secret that he anointed David. Como shekatuv lemala, v'shama Shaul v'yargeni, uvemot Shmuel yitgale hadavar. That means to say, the whole period of history where David and Shaul is running after David, kept quiet. Nobody knows that Shmuel actually anointed David HaMelech. It was never revealed. So therefore, what does David know? David now runs to Shmuel and he says to me, you anointed me as king. Nobody knows about this. And that's what the Chidah says in line 120. Lo eshivo. He doesn't answer him. He can't go and go to Shaul and tell him, stop attacking David. Why not? Because Shmuel is scared. If I go and tell that I anointed Shmuel, I anointed David HaMelech, I'm going to be, perhaps Shaul will send his messengers to kill me. Therefore, Shmuel is in this terrible predicament. What's he going to do? And that, Rabotai, is the story of Shmuel. Shmuel anoints 2 kings. Okay? Hashem, so to speak, tells him, don't do anything. I have my plans. I have my, how the story of Shaul and David HaMelech will work it out. But Shmuel never says anything. Questions? Yes, Phil.
What about B'tochen? It's hard to believe that Shmuel was afraid of carrying out God's order.
He did it. He kept out God's orders, but he doesn't publicize it.
No, but he's afraid for his life.
He's afraid of publicizing it.
Wouldn't God have protected him?
Do you rely on miracles, Phil? Ein somchim al hanes.
But this is first-class nest. That, it's a first-class nest. It's a very, very loaded, dangerous.
True. According to the Malbem, it is complicated because Shmuel could have gone to Shaul and tell him, why are you running after David? But Shmuel says, no, I'm not willing to. Hashem has his course of and we'll see now. Pardon?
Well, it's really a question of what is his betochen.
I agree with you, but what do you do if you know Shmuel knows that?
He did the right thing. I think he did the right thing, but he could have asked Hashem, what do I do now?
What's the way to do now? What would Hashem answered him? Shmuel knows Hashem would have answered him. Nature will take its course.
So that he had to shut up.
He had to shut up. That's what he says.
Yeah.
1 minute. No, the family don't know. The family don't know.
The Abrabanel.
My wife's asking me, didn't the family know? So I said, no, they didn't, because he put David on the side. And then none of them knew that he was appointed as king. Perhaps Yishai knew, and he kept quiet. Okay, let's give ourselves an example, another example which we learned. Yaakov, the sons of Yaakov and Yosef never ever revealed to Yaakov that he was ever sold. Okay, that means sometimes there's a necessity to hide things in order to keep families living. Just imagine to yourselves what would have happened if Shaul would have known that David HaMelech was anointed as king. He'd have gone and killed all the family of Yishai. He would have killed everybody. He was so at this persecution complex, and we see later before this that he kills the whole of Nov Ira Kohanim. He kills 85 Kohanim, okay, because he thinks that they hate David HaMelech. Shaul was and we don't find necessarily that Shaul was punished for this. Okay, it's not said in the Tanakh, but here we have this business between Shaul and David, which is very, very complicated, and Shmuel kept it quiet. Now we're going to go to the next part, which is quite fascinating. Okay, and it really gives us the insight of the feelings, the deep feelings which exists here. Now we're going to learn the first part, chapter Chaf Dalet. Vayhi ka'asher shav Shaul me'acharei HaPlishtim, after Shaul fights against the Plishtim, vayagidu lo lemor hinei David b'midbar ein gedi. Okay, he's by the Dead Sea. Vayikach Shaul 3,000 ish bachur mikol Yisrael, 3,000 soldiers, and they are running after David. Vayelech levakesh David v'al anshav al pnei tzurei hayelim. Anybody who knows En Gedi knows that above En Gedi is the rocks of the Elim. Vayavo el gidrot atzon al haderech, and they come there where they're all fences around the flock of sheep. B'sham ma'ara, and there's a cave there. Vayavo Shaul, and Shaul walks into the cave by himself. He goes without his guards. Why? Because he has to go to the bathroom. Shaul goes in there by himself. The David va'anashav biyarkatei hama'ara yoshvim. And David and his men are sitting nearby in the cave. Vayomru anshe David elav, and David's friends, an army, his band, say to him, Hinei hayom asher amar Hashem elecha, hinei anochi noten et oivcha biyadecha. His friends say, listen, this is the day God's given you. Go and kill him. V'asita lo kasher yitav beinecha. What does David HaMelech do? Vayakom David gets up, vayichrot et knaf ha'me'il asher shel Shaul balad. The only thing he does is he cuts off part of his coat. David has this terrible conscience about even cutting the corner of Shaul's coat. Asher karatet kanaf asher Shaul. And what does he say to them? What does he say to his men? Vayomeli, why have I got a conscience? Vayomel anashav chalila li me'Hashem. Im eseh et hadavar hazeh le'adoni. L'Mashiach Hashem. How could I have done this to the Mashiach of Hashem? Lishloach yadibo, to even think of cutting off his coat. Ki Mashiach Hashemu, he's been anointed as a king by Hashem. And David HaMelech carries on and says, Yeshasah David anashav badvarim. David HaMelech breaks down the people, his band, with words. V'lo natanam lakum el Shaul. He doesn't allow them to get up towards Shaul. V'Shaul kam me'ama'ara, and Shaul gets up from the cave. Vayelech badarech. Now, that is the first thing. Let's just read the beautiful insights of the Abrabanel. And he says the following: V'David va'anashav ayu b'ktzei ha'ma'ara, ki hayta ma'ara gdola ma'od. It was a very big cave, like we all know. V'ayu kulom nechba'im ba. V'kasher ra'u, when they saw Shaul alone in the cave, אמרו לדוד, באמת זה היום אשר אמר אלוקי להתברך שנתן את אויבך בידיך. ואמרו זה להגיד, שהיה ביאת שאול שמה, מסודרת מהקל יתברך לשיהרגהו דוד. They felt that this is divine providence. Shaul goes by himself into the cave. He doesn't want anybody to see him going to the bathroom. Sneers. Even the king feels that when I go to the bathroom, nobody should be next to me. Even the king. And what do the people, the band of David HaMelech, say? No, this is divine providence. This is the time to kill him. Son, this is what you should do. באומרם נתן השם. ודוד הלך אליו בלט מאחוריו ויחרט את כנף מעילו. וזכר הכתוב, מחסידותו, David HaMelech's piousness, ויושר לבבו and his integrity, שגם הדבר הקטן ההוא, even the smallest thing, ההוא, like cutting off the corner of his me'il, line 55, נתחרט, he was sorry על מה שעשה אותו. שהיה בעיניו, כמרים יד במלך, as if he's rebelling against the king. וזהו ויח לב דוד אותו. And David's heart, he had this terrible concept, conscience. כי חשב, שמא יחשב בזה העוון. That this should be considered a sin. ואמרו חכמינו בפרק הרואה, כל המבזה את הבגדים, anybody who shows up, that means uses his clothes in a wrong way, לסוף אינו נהנה מהם. At the end of the days, he won't have benefit from them. שנאמר, at the end of David's life, it gets very, very cold. And as much as they cover him, ויכסו בבגדים ולא יחם לו. And Chazal say, why could he have never any benefit from his clothes? כי בעבור שקרע דוד מעיל שאול, because he cuts off the corner of the coat of Shaul, נענש, he was punished. שלא יחם לו, מרוב הבגדים בזקנותו. Okay? We'll get to that in a minute. What do clothes signify? We'll speak about that in a minute. ולפי, says the Abrabanel, שאנשיו אמרו לו שיהרגהו, כאשר חזק עם כנף המעיל בידו, אמר חלילה לי, חס וחלילה, מהשם אם יעשה הדבר הזה, אשר אמרתם לאדוני למשיח השם. רצה לומר, בשתי בחינות היה דבר מגונה להורגו. האחד, בהיותו אדוני, he's my king. וכל מי שהורג את אדונו יהיה מי שיהיה ומורד וקושר קשר. Anybody who kills off a king is like rebelling. כמו שנאמר, זמרי הורג אדוניו. והשני, and the second, מהשם משיח השם. He's been anointed by God. ולפי, what do they say to him? לפי שהם אומרים, what does David's band say? No. ולפי הם היו אומרים, שגם דוד היה משיח השם. You are also the Mashiach. His band, no, but Shmuel never reveals it. רוצה לומר, אמר דוד, עוד כי משיח השם הוא, he's still the one who's been appointed. רוצה לומר, עדיין הוא שאול משיח השם. ואין ספק שכיוון גם דוד כל כך לייקר שמירת המלאכים. How careful a person has got to be to honor the king, ושלא יקלו בכבודם. לפי שהיה עתיד למלוך. He was also going to be king. ונתן למוד אשר יועילו אחר כך, and he was teaching them how to behave towards a king. ולזה הרג המלאקי, and that's why David HaMelech kills the Amaleki שהרג את שאול, ולאנשים שהרגו את תשבושת. וזהו וישסע דוד את אנשיו בדברים שגער בהם. ולפי שהם היו רוצים על כל פנים להרוג את שאול, לא נתנם דוד לקום ולפגוע בו. והיה כל זה לדוד בסיבת חסידותו וישרותו, his piety and his integrity. ולהיות ליבו בטוח בשם. And he was sure that Hashem has got his plans שימליכו, כמו שנאמר לו על ידי נביא. ושאול יומו יבוא. One day, the day of Shaul will end. Or Hashem yigafenu, or Hashem, or he'll die naturally, or Hashem will kill him. But Yado, the hand of David, al tiyeh bo. But David HaMelech is not going to do anything. Rabbi Sai, here we have the most important dimension of how David HaMelech perceives Shaul. David HaMelech is being run after. He legally has got the right. We've got the laws of Rodef and Nirdaf. The person who's running after somebody to kill him, you're allowed to get up and kill him. David HaMelech, when he comes to Shaul, has a different perspective completely. Now, and he goes and he cuts off the king's coat, which we'll learn soon, not today, but the next shiur. What is the implication of this cutting? But now, what I want to speak about learn with you, is the following. That is the story. That is the story. But what does David HaMelech feel? He's in the cave. And Shaul's come inside. And he's surrounded. What does he do? How does he behave? What does he feel? Now, the narrator of the story just gives an objective perspective. But what does David feel? And here we have to go to Tehillim. Tehillim will teach us. We will learn 2 chapters in Tehillim. We won't learn them completely now. But we're going to read, not learn, we're going to read 2 chapters in Tehillim. Okay? One of them, perhaps you don't know. But one of them we say very often. And we're going to read them, and I've one of them, I've put the English translation next to it. It'll be easier for you to see. And it says the following. Tehillim. Lamnatseach al tashchet leDavid. Don't destroy David HaMelech. Now there are 3 chapters, Perek Nun Zayin, Nun Chet, Nun Tet, which all begin with al tashchet, which we'll see in a minute what it means. LeDavid, Michtam, Bevorcho mipnei Shaul b'ma'ara. This is David HaMelech's prayer inside the cave. Says the Radak, Vinyan HaMizmorim alalu, line number 80. V'inei inyan HaMizmorim ha'ele b'inyan David im Shaul. ואפשר שהיה לעניין זה תחילתם על תשחית, כלומר תפילה לקהל, שלא ישחיתוהו ביד שאול, he shouldn't be destroyed by the hands of Shaul. ומצאנו הלשון הזה בעניין מיתה שנאמר דוד אל אבישי כשרצה להמית את שאול, אל תשחיתהו. וזה המזמור. That means David HaMelech realizes that Shaul has come to kill him. וזה המזמור אמרו דוד, בעוד שהיה הוא ואנשיו בירכתי המערה. They were inside the cave. ובא שאול להסך את רגליו שם. And Shaul HaMelech comes to go to the bathroom there. He uses it as a toilet. So we've got Perek Nun Zayin, which we'll read in 1 minute. But let's just go further down to line number 90. Perek Kuf Membet. And we're going to read this Tehillim quickly, because some of it you know. Maskila David, Bioto Bamarat Tfilah. Rashi says, where did this take place? In the cave Shekarat Ba Knaf HaMe'il Asher LeShaul. This is the cave. So David HaMelech has 2 Tehillim speaking about his feelings inside the cave. Because what could happen? If somebody would speak too loudly, Shaul will know. and he'll bring in his soldiers. And David HaMelech there is stuck. And what does he say? Maskil David biyoto b'amarat tefillah. Koli el Hashem ezak, koli el Hashem etchanan. I'm crying out to Hashem. Eshpoch lefanav sichi. I'm davening to you. Sarati, all my troubles, lefanav agid. Bitatef alai ruchi, when my spirit covers me over. Vatay adata nizivati b'orach zu alech tamnu pachli. They have made me. I've got a pach. I'm in trouble. They've made me. I'm stuck here. Habet yuminu re'eh ve'en li makir. Avad manos mimeni. I've got nowhere to run. Ein doresh nafshi. Za'akti elecha Hashem. Amarti. Ata machsi. You are the one who looks after me. Chalki be'eretz hachayim. Hakshiv erinati ki daloti mod. Listen to my prayer because I've become very poor. Hatzileni mirot fai. Save me from those who are chasing me. Ki amtzu mimeni, because they're greater than me, stronger than me. Hotzia mimazger nafshi lodot et shemecha. I'm asking you to take away this sort of prison which my soul is in order to thank you. Bi achtiru tzadikim tigmol alai. That is one tehillah, which David HaMelech is in the cave. Often we say it now when we're in Tzarot, and we say this Tehillah, Kuf Membet, and also Shir HaMalot, Mimakim Kraticha Hashem. They are two of the most popular chapters of Sefer Tehillim, and this is what David HaMelech said in the cave. Now let's go to the one before that, which is longer. This one, Emir Hashem, the next Shiur, we'll learn in great detail. Lam Natseach, and here you've got the English translation, which I've taken from Safaria. I don't know how exact it is, but it's in front of you so that you can read it. Lam Natseach al tashchet leDavid michtam bevorcho mipnei Shaul b'ma'ara. Choneni Elokim choneni, ki b'cha chasaya nafshi, uvetzel knafecha echse ad ya'avor havot, until danger passes. Ekra lelokim elyon, le'el gomer alai. Yishlach mishamayim v'yoshieni. Cheref shoafi sela. Yishlach Elohim chasdo v'amitho. Nafshi betoch levaim eshkava. I'm now lying down amongst man-eating lions. Bitoch levaim eshkava. Lohatim b'nei adam. Shinehem chanit v'chitzim. Uleshonam cherev chada. That means the people who are running after me are only waiting to kill me. Ruma ala shamayim elokim kol haaretz kvodecha. Reshet, they prepared a net, echinu lifamai. Kafaf nafshi, karu lefanai shicha, naflu betoch hasela. They made a pit for me. Nachon libi elokim, nachon libi ashira v'azamera. Ura kvodi, ura hanevel, v'chinor, ha'ir hashachar. Odcha ba'amim Adonai azamercha ba'al umim, ki gadol, עד שמיים חסדך, ועד שחקים עמיתך, רומה על שמיים אלוקים, על כל הארץ כבודך. Two Tehillim. David HaMelech says in the cave. Two Tehillim, or what we know of, what the Anshe Knesset Agdolah took from all the tefillot of David HaMelech. And two of them take place in this cave, according to the Meforshim. David HaMelech feels that his life is trapped. He's in a snare. He can't get out of it. Shaul's walked in by himself. And if you make too much noise, Shaul HaMelech will reveal that his enemy is in the cave. And David HaMelech there is praying and praying. that Hashem should give him the kochot. He doesn't know what to do. And that gives us the insights of the feelings of David HaMelech. So therefore, when we learn Sefer Shmuel, we always have to use Sefer Tehillim to give insights, psychological insights, emotional insights to the stories which take place in Sefer Shmuel. Now, let's just read the introduction of the Malbem in line number 100. Lamnatseach al tashchet. Yan shilinyan hazeh. On this subject, chiber od mizmor, another mizmor, lekaman, further ahead, siman kufbet. V'sham diber mitzarato levad. There he speaks about, in Kuf Mem Bet, he only speaks about his troubles. Upo diber, and also here he speaks, gam mimashekafat yitzro. He speaks about how he managed to control his yetzer. Leval yashchit et Shaul. The hashchata could be Shaul killing him, and it could be him killing Shaul. So therefore, Lamnatzeach al tashchet goes on both things. Shaul killing him, and David HaMelech killing Shaul. Shekain tafas al ze lashon hashchata. ומזמור זה נחלק לשני חלקים. תפילה שינצל, until pasuk chet, okay, until where it's written, reshet techinu lifamai, afaf nafshi karu lefanai, talks about, says the Malbem, the prayer that he should be saved. And then it says, medaber mima shelo harag et Shaul. The kavash yitzro, v'zeh haya lo lekavod v'tiferet, and this became something which was amazing, that David HaMelech manages to control himself. Remember, he is the nirdaf. He's the one who's being chased. He runs to Shmuel to pray. He runs all around Eretz Yisrael and has to daven. But David HaMelech doesn't do anything. How can I do anything against Mashiach Hashem? Ad sheshaul hikir et tzidkuto ve'emunato. We'll see at the end of this chapter, Perek Chaf Daled, how Shaul himself admits how David HaMelech is a tzaddik. That will be the end of this story. Mitzvah Hashem, the next shiur, we will carry on and see how this story ends. What happened there? And we always learn Tehillim together with Shmuel. Always. That's the way we should learn it. Because we have different dimensions. The objective dimension, the narrator of the story, and the way David HaMelech feels. Because every single one of us feels something when we learn the stories of Tanakh, and especially this terrible episode in David HaMelech's life between Shaul and David. I wish you all a good Shabbos. If there are any questions, Heyarot. Yes, Phil.
Last question. What was the chapter in Tehillim, the Kuf Mem Beis, and what was the other one? Because it was blocked. I wanted to mark it.
Zayin, 1 minute, I'll tell you now. It is Nun Zayin.
Good, I got them both.
Nun Zayin.
The only question I have is, who knew what at what time?
Sorry?
Who knew what? Like, who knew that David was anointed and that Shaul was still anointed?
The only people who seem to know might have been Yishai, his father, and the band of people who joined David. According to the Malbim, they knew it. They knew that David HaMelech was anointed. Nobody else knew it.
Did Shaul know it?
No, we'll see soon at the end of this chapter, what happens at the end of this chapter, where Shaul will, so to speak, have a feeling that David has been anointed as king.
So if
And that's at the end
Shmuel,
of this chapter.
if Shmuel had spoken up earlier,
No, not Shmuel has spoken. No, Shmuel does not speak at all.
I
You
know.
will, you will see how Shaul gets this feeling from David HaMelech, and that's why I'm stopping now, that you should come back in 3 weeks' time to
I'll
listen
come
to the
back.
next year.
But there's a failure of communication. In other
It could
words,
be a failure.
they thought
Listen.
that David was
Okay,
really-
okay. Let me ask you a question. Okay.
Yeah.
You have elections. We have elections, etc., etc. We never have a situation where you have two prime ministers at the same time, except through rotation, which is agreement. Okay. Here we don't have a rotation. Okay. We have a far worse situation.
But we have a Novi involved.
But the Novi, HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells him not to say anything. Because I'm controlling, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, I'm controlling the world.
Oh, he is.
Yeah, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is controlling the world, and
You
he doesn't let
say-
Shmuel say anything.
So I'm trying to figure out why Shaul would be chasing David. Now, it seems on the face of it, he's chasing David because David is an upstart.
He's an upstart, he's a what's it called? He's totally jealous of him. He manages to kill Goliath. He manages to do this. Everybody thinks he's the biggest hero in town. Okay, and Shaul, and remember, straight away after David HaMelech is anointed, Shaul gets into this depression. Somehow, if you look in page number 2, 3, which we learned about Shaul, you will see that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, so to speak, takes away Ruach HaKodesh from Shaul,
Yeah,
if
he
you
was
remember.
fired. He was fired. But David
He was
didn't-
fired. That means to say he was fired, but he was still a king.
Yeah.
And that's the tragedy. Why does HaKadosh Baruch Hu do this to Shaul? That's a problem,
Okay.
which we'll try to get through later on.
Okay. Thank you very much. It's an excellent piece of work.
Yeah. Okay, then. Any other questions? Nobody. Okay, have a good Shabbos, everybody.
Goodbye,
Keep
Shaul.
well. I'll see you in a few weeks' time, 3 weeks' time, 2 weeks' time.
Shabbat shalom. Shabbat
Shabbat
shalom.
shalom.
Shabbat shalom.